My name is Sarah Bennett, and I live at 43 Oakwood Drive, a quiet suburban neighborhood that's always felt safe and comforting. I'm a 32-year-old nurse, and I've been working at Greenridge Hospital for the past 5 years. It's a small facility, tucked away at the edge of town, surrounded by dense woods that make the hospital feel isolated, especially during the night shifts. I've seen my share of odd things working the graveyard shift, but nothing could prepare me for what happened one stormy night in October. It was a typical Friday evening when I arrived at the hospital. The wind howled outside, rattling the windows as I made my way to the nurses' station. The storm had knocked out power to half the town, but the hospital's generators kept everything running smoothly. I checked the patient roster, only 6 patients tonight, most of them elderly with various ailments. It should have been a quiet night, but something felt off from the moment I stepped inside. Around midnight, the storm intensified. Lightning lit up the sky, followed by thunder that seemed to shake the entire building. The lights flickered a few times but stayed on. I was alone at the nurses' station, sipping on a cup of coffee, when I noticed something strange on the security monitors. One of the cameras showed the hallway on the 2nd floor, where the old psychiatric wing used to be. The wing had been shut down years ago after the hospital moved its psychiatric patients to a larger facility in the city. The hallway was supposed to be empty, but on the screen, I saw a figure standing in the shadows at the far end. I leaned in closer, trying to make out who it was, but the camera feed was grainy. The figure was tall, almost unnaturally so, and they stood perfectly still, facing away from the camera. I frowned, wondering if maybe a patient had wandered up there, though I couldn't imagine why. The 2nd floor was locked up tight, with no reason for anyone to be there. Curiosity got the better of me. I grabbed my flashlight and headed to the 2nd floor. As I climbed the stairs, the building seemed eerily quiet. The storm raged outside, but inside, everything was still. I reached the top of the stairs and pushed open the door to the hallway. It creaked loudly, echoing down the empty corridor. I stepped inside, shining my flashlight ahead. The hallway was just as I remembered it, long, with faded linoleum floors and peeling paint on the walls. The air felt colder up here, almost suffocatingly so. I walked slowly, my footsteps the only sound in the silence. I reached the spot where the figure had been standing on the monitor, but there was no one there, just an empty stretch of hallway. I felt a chill run down my spine. I was about to turn back when I heard a faint sound, a whisper, so soft I almost didn't catch it. I froze, straining to hear. The whisper came again, more distinct this time. It was coming from one of the old patient rooms. I hesitated for a moment before slowly approaching the door. It was slightly ajar, just enough for me to see inside. I pushed it open with my flashlight, illuminating the dark room. The furniture had been removed when the wing was closed, leaving only an empty bed frame and a few scattered papers. But in the corner, huddled in the darkness, was the figure. My breath caught in my throat. The figure was crouched, facing the wall. It wore what looked like a hospital gown, and its long dark hair hung down, obscuring its face. I wanted to call out, to ask who they were, but the words caught in my throat. Something about the way they were positioned, so unnaturally still, made my skin crawl. Before I could react, the figure slowly turned its head to face me. Its eyes were wide and empty, void of any life. The skin was pale, almost translucent, and there was a twisted, unnatural smile on its face. I stumbled back, nearly dropping my flashlight. "Who are you?" I finally managed to choke out, my voice trembling. The figure just stared at me, that eerie smile never wavering. Then, in a voice that sounded like it was coming from deep within the walls, it whispered, "You don't belong here." A wave of nausea washed over me, as the room seemed to tilt. I turned and fled, running down the hallway as fast as I could. The door to the stairs slammed shut behind me with a deafening bang, and I practically flew down the steps, my mind reeling. I didn't stop until I was back at the nurses' station, panting and shaking. I looked at the security monitor again, and the figure was gone. The hallway was empty once more, but I knew what I had seen. There was something up there, something that wasn't supposed to be. I tried to shake it off and focus on my duties, but the sense of unease lingered. I checked on my patients, all of whom were asleep, unaware of the terror I had just experienced. The rest of the night passed slowly, each minute dragging by as I waited for my shift to end. When the morning staff arrived, I was more than ready to leave. I didn't mention what I had seen to anyone. Who would believe me? But as I stepped outside into the early morning light, I couldn't shake the feeling that I had come too close to something dark and malevolent. That night, I did some research on the hospital's history, something I had never bothered with before. I found an old article from decades ago, detailing the death of a young woman in the psychiatric wing. She had taken her own life, they said, after years of suffering from severe depression and hallucinations. The article mentioned that her body had been found in the very room where I had seen the figure. I haven't worked a night shift since. I requested to be transferred to the day shift, and thankfully, my supervisor agreed. But even now, whenever I pass by the hospital at night, I feel a deep, unsettling fear. I don't know what I saw that night, but I'm certain it was more than just a figment of my imagination. Some things are better left undisturbed, buried in the past. But in that hospital, where the veil between the living and the dead seems thinner, I learned the hard way that some spirits never rest. I've worked the night shift at the hospital for years, and some stories get passed around. The usual tales are about lights flickering, unexplained cold spots, and patients seeing strange things. I never paid much attention to them, until I got assigned to the old wing for the first time. The old wing was where we kept long-term patients, mostly those in comas or those who needed constant care but weren't in any immediate danger. It was quieter than the rest of the hospital, almost forgotten. The hallways were dimly lit, the smell of disinfectant mixing with the musty odor of an outdated building. It was the kind of place that got under your skin if you spent too much time there, and most staff avoided it when they could. I had just finished my rounds in the newer part of the hospital, when I got a call from the nurses' station. They needed me to cover room 432 for the rest of the night. A routine check, nothing serious. Room 432 had been empty for months. The last patient, an elderly woman, had passed away under strange circumstances. There were rumors that she had died screaming, eyes wide open, but no one ever confirmed it. Still, it was just an empty room now, nothing to be worried about, or so I thought. When I reached the old wing, the hallway leading to room 432 felt colder than usual. The kind of cold that makes the hairs on the back of your neck stand up. I brushed it off as a draft from the old windows and continued walking. The door to room 432 was slightly ajar, which was strange since it had been locked ever since the old woman died. I hesitated for a moment, then pushed the door open. The room was just as I remembered it, empty except for a single hospital bed, the pale blue sheets neatly folded over the mattress. The air felt heavy, like the room hadn't been aired out in weeks. I stepped inside to check the monitors, making sure everything was for the next patient. That's when I heard it. A faint, rhythmic tapping coming from the far corner of the room. At first I thought it was the heating system kicking in. But then I remembered. The heating in this wing had been turned off months ago. The sound was too deliberate, too precise, like something, or someone, was tapping their fingers on the wall. I turned toward the corner, my eyes straining to see in the dim light. Nothing. Just the bare walls and the faint glow of the street lights outside filtering through the blinds. Then the tapping stopped, replaced by a low, guttural whisper. It was so quiet at first, that I thought I was imagining it. But as I strained to listen, the whisper grew louder, more distinct. It wasn't English, and it wasn't any language I recognized. It was harsh, guttural, almost like a growl, but there was a rhythm to it, as though someone, or something, was chanting under their breath. I backed toward the door, suddenly aware of how wrong everything felt at that moment. The air felt thick, almost suffocating, and the walls seemed to close in on me. The whispering stopped as soon as I reached the doorway, replaced by a heavy silence. But it wasn't the comforting kind of silence you get in an empty room. This silence was oppressive, like the air itself was waiting for something to happen. I quickly stepped out into the hallway, but just as I turned to leave, something caught my eye, a shadow, moving along the far wall. It wasn't the shadow of someone walking past the windows, though. It was taller, more distorted, its movements jerky and unnatural, like a broken puppet being dragged along by invisible strings. I froze, my mind racing to make sense of what I was seeing. The shadow twisted and writhed along the wall, growing darker and more defined with each passing second. Then, without warning, it shot toward me, a dark mass rushing across the room. I slammed the door shut, my breath catching in my throat as I pressed my back against it. For a moment, everything was silent again. No tapping, no whispering, no shadow. Just the steady hum of the hospital and my shallow breathing. I stood there for what felt like hours, waiting for something else to happen, but nothing did. Slowly, cautiously, I peeled myself away from the door and hurried back down the hallway, not daring to look back. When I reached the nurse's station, I tried to explain what had happened, but the words got caught in my throat. How could I explain something that made no sense? The other nurses looked at me like I was crazy, and maybe I was, but I knew what I saw, and I knew that whatever was in room 432 wasn't done yet. I spent the rest of my shift avoiding that wing, keeping myself busy with paperwork and patient rounds. But the feeling never left me. That cold, oppressive weight hung in the air around room 432. It followed me, lingering at the edges of my consciousness like a shadow that refused to leave. The next night, I was assigned to the old wing again. I almost refused, but I couldn't explain why without sounding paranoid. So, I took a deep breath and told myself it was all in my head. When I passed by room 432, I couldn't help but glance at the door. It was locked, just as it should be. But something was different. A single piece of paper was taped to the door, a discharge form with the name of a new patient. I felt a cold chill run through me as I realized the room was about to be occupied again. I never found out what happened to the new patient. I was transferred to another part of the hospital the following week, and I haven't been back to the old wing since. But sometimes, late at night when everything is quiet, I still hear that faint tapping in the back of my mind. My name is Jacob Turner, and I live at 1023 Maple Lane, in a small, unassuming town where nothing ever seems to happen. I'm years old, and I've been an orderly at Riverview Hospital for the past 3 years. It's not the most glamorous job, but it pays the bills, and the night shifts are usually quiet, until last Thursday night. Riverview is a medium-sized hospital, mostly serving the elderly and long-term patients. The building is old, dating back to the early 1900s, with creaky floors and endless hallways stretching into darkness at night. The hospital has a reputation among the staff, whispers of strange occurrences that nobody talks about openly but everyone knows about. I always dismissed the stories as just that, stories. But what I experienced that night made me question everything. It was a prolonged night, the kind where time seems to crawl. The winter wind howled outside, and the occasional rattle of old windows reminded me how isolated the place felt when the sun went down. I was stationed at the nurses' station on the 3rd floor, where the long-term care patients were kept. The wing was dimly lit, with most of the patients already asleep, their monitors softly beeping in the background. Around 2 a.m., the quiet was broken by a strange sound coming from one of the rooms at the far end of the hallway. It was a low, rhythmic tapping, almost like someone drumming their fingers on a table. At first, I thought it might be one of the patients awake and restless, so I decided to check it out. As I walked down the hallway, the tapping grew louder. It was coming from room 308, a room that was supposed to be empty. The patient who had been staying there had passed away 2 days ago, and the room was waiting to be cleaned and prepared for the next occupant. I stopped outside the door, feeling a chill that had nothing to do with the cold draft in the hallway. The door was slightly ajar, and the tapping continued, steady and deliberate. I hesitated for a moment, then pushed the door open, shining my flashlight into the darkness. The room was empty, just as it should have been. The bed was stripped, the curtains drawn. Yet, the tapping persisted. I scanned the room, searching for the source of the sound, and my eyes were drawn to the far corner, where the old radiator stood. It was ancient, a relic from when the building was first constructed, and it often made noises as the pipes heated up and cooled down. But this sound was different, more purposeful. I stepped closer, my flashlight illuminating the chipped paint and rusting metal of the radiator, and then I saw it, A small dark figure crouched next to the radiator, tapping its bony fingers against the metal. It was a child, or at least, it looked like one at first. Its skin was pale and thin, stretched over a gaunt frame, and its eyes were wide and black, staring straight at me. I froze, unable to comprehend what I was seeing. The figure slowly turned its head towards me, and a grin spread across its face, revealing rows of sharp, jagged teeth. I backed away, nearly tripping over my own feet as I tried to put distance between myself and whatever this thing was. But it didn't move. It just sat there, watching me, its grin never fading. The tapping had stopped, replaced by an oppressive silence that seemed to fill the room. I forced myself to move, turning and rushing out of the room, slamming the door behind me. I hurried back to the nurse's station, my mind racing with what I had just witnessed. I didn't know if I should tell someone, but who would believe me? It didn't make any sense. I tried to focus on my work, checking the monitors and making sure the patients were all right, but I couldn't shake the image of that thing from my mind. The rest of the night passed in a blur. I kept glancing at the clock, counting down the minutes until my shift ended. Every creak, every rustle made me jump, expecting to see that figure again. But nothing else happened. When the morning staff arrived, I handed over my reports and practically bolted out of the hospital. I needed to get out of there, to get away from whatever was in that room. As soon as I got home, I collapsed onto my bed, exhausted but unable to sleep. The next day I couldn't stop thinking about it. I needed answers, something to explain what I had seen. I went online searching for any information about Riverview's history, hoping to find some rational explanation. I came across an old article, buried in the archives of a local newspaper. The article was from 1947, and it told the story of a fire that had broken out in the hospital's children's ward, which used to be on the 3rd floor, where the long-term care unit is now. Several children had died in the fire, trapped in their rooms as the flames spread. The article mentioned that some of the bodies had never been recovered, lost in the rubble when part of the building collapsed. A cold dread settled over me as I read. The thought that the figure I saw could be one of those lost children, trapped in some twisted version of the afterlife, made my skin crawl. I didn't know what to do with this information. Should I tell someone? Should I quit my job? I returned to work the next night, but I couldn't bring myself to go near room 308. I stayed as far away from that end of the hallway as possible, and I've avoided it ever since. But the memory of that night haunts me, especially when I'm alone in the hospital at night. I don't know what I saw, or why it was there. Maybe it was a ghost, or maybe it was something far worse. All I know is that Riverview Hospital is not as empty as it seems, and some things are better left undisturbed. My name is Lucas Weaver, and I work as a night shift janitor at a large hospital downtown. I live at 245 Brookside Avenue, just a few blocks away from where I've worked for the past 7 years. The job is quiet, especially after midnight, when most of the staff and visitors have left, and only the patients remain in their beds. It's the kind of job where you don't ask questions, and you just focus on cleaning. But something happened last week that changed everything for me. It was a Thursday night, and I was assigned to clean the East Wing, a part of the hospital that had been shut down for years. The wing used to house the psychiatric ward, but it had been closed after an incident that no one talked about. All I knew was that the hospital had sealed it off, and now it was just a forgotten part of the building, filled with old equipment, dusty furniture, and peeling wallpaper. The hospital had recently started renovations, and they wanted the wing cleared out. My supervisor told me to head in and start cleaning the halls and removing any debris. I wasn't thrilled about the assignment, but it wasn't like I could refuse. So, I grabbed my supplies, walked down the long, dimly lit corridors, and unlocked a heavy door that led to the East Wing. The air was musty, stale, and unnervingly cold. As I stepped inside, I couldn't help but feel an overwhelming sense of unease. The lights were dim, flickering now and then, casting strange shadows along the walls. The place was eerily quiet, except for the occasional hum of the ventilation system. I began sweeping the floors, trying to focus on the task at hand. The halls were lined with old patient rooms, most of them empty, but a few still had gurneys or beds covered in dusty sheets. I pushed my cleaning cart down the hallway, making my way through each room, one by one. About an hour into the job I heard something, faint, but unmistakable. It was a low murmur, like someone talking just out of earshot. At first I thought it was the wind, or maybe a distant conversation from another part of the hospital. But as I moved closer to one of the old patient rooms, the murmuring grew louder, clearer. I stopped in front of room 409, my hand resting on the doorknob. The sound was coming from inside. I told myself it was probably just an old radio or maybe some leftover equipment malfunctioning, but a strange feeling washed over me. I hesitated, then slowly turned the knob and pushed the door open. The room was empty, or at least it appeared to be. There was an old hospital bed in the center, with restraints still attached to the sides, the kind they used for psychiatric patients back in the day. The walls were covered in faded yellow wallpaper, and the only light came from a single flickering bulb in the corner. The murmuring had stopped, but I could still feel a presence, something lingering in the room. I stepped inside, scanning the walls, the floor, and the ceiling, looking for anything that might explain the sound. Then I saw it. A message scrawled across the far wall, written in what looked like dried, dark stains. "I am still here." I backed out of the room, my pulse quickening. I knew the East Wing had been closed for years, so who could have written that? And why was it still there after all this time? I decided I'd had enough of room 409 and moved on to the next hallway, trying to shake off the unease. As I continued cleaning, I couldn't help but feel like I was being watched. Every creak, every soft tap echoed through the empty wing, making it feel as though the building itself was alive. I tried to stay calm, convincing myself it was just my imagination. But then, the lights in the hallway flickered and went out. I stood in complete darkness, my flashlight the only source of light. I shined it down the hallway, and that's when I saw something, someone. A figure stood at the far end of the corridor, its back turned to me, dressed in what looked like an old hospital gown. I froze, staring at the figure, unsure of what to do. "Hello?" I called out, my voice shaky. The figure didn't move. It just stood there, motionless, as if it hadn't heard me at all. I took a step forward, and that's when it turned around. Its face was obscured by shadows, but I could see its eyes, dark, sunken, and filled with malevolent energy that made my skin crawl. The figure tilted its head as if it were studying me, and then it smiled, a twisted, unnatural grin that sent a chill down my spine. I didn't wait to see what it would do next. I turned and ran, pushing my cart down the hallway, my feet pounding against the floor. I didn't stop until I was back at the heavy door that separated the East Wing from the rest of the hospital. I fumbled with my keys, my hands shaking, and finally managed to unlock the door. I slammed it shut behind me, locking it tightly. For a few moments I stood there, catching my breath, and listening to the silence. The rest of the hospital was as calm as ever, as if nothing had happened. I walked back to the janitor's closet, trying to make sense of what I had seen, but there was no explanation. The next day, I reported the incident to my supervisor. He listened, but I could tell he didn't believe me. He chalked it up to exhaustion, telling me to take a few days off to rest. But I knew what I had seen. The figure, the writing on the wall, none of it was in my head. I haven't gone back to the East Wing since that night, and I don't plan to. Whatever is in that part of the hospital, it's not something that should be disturbed. Maybe it's the remnants of the psychiatric patients who were once held there. Or maybe it's something much older, something darker. All I know is that Riverview Hospital isn't as empty as it seems after dark. And I'll never forget the feeling of those dark eyes watching me from the shadows. My name is Thomas Caldwell, and for the last 12 years, I've been a night nurse at the Stonegate Regional Hospital. I live at 42 Sycamore Lane, a quiet street in the middle of a town that's as sleepy as the nights I often spend on shift. My job is straightforward: check on patients, monitor their vitals, and make sure nothing goes wrong during the night. There's a rhythm to it, a routine that I've grown comfortable with over the years. That was until 2 weeks ago when everything changed. It was around 2 a.m., my usual round time. The hospital was mostly quiet, with the faint hum of machines and the occasional beeping of heart monitors breaking the silence. I was assigned to the general care ward that night, 6 patients, most of them elderly, recovering from surgery or various ailments. It was a routine shift, and I expected nothing out of the ordinary. But as I made my way down the corridor, something felt off. One of the rooms at the end of the hall, room 308, had its door slightly ajar. I remember closing it earlier in the evening, so seeing it open like that caught my attention. I walked over, peered inside, and found an unfamiliar face staring back at me. A woman, pale and thin, was sitting upright in the bed. She was in a hospital gown, her long black hair tangled and draped over her shoulders. Her eyes were wide open, staring directly at me, unblinking. I checked my clipboard and saw that no one was supposed to be in that room. Room 308 had been vacant for days. "Ma'am, are you lost?" I asked, stepping into the room cautiously. She didn't respond. She just kept staring, her mouth slightly open, as if she wanted to say something but couldn't find the words. I reached for the call button to alert the head nurse, but before I could press it, the woman spoke. Her voice was barely a whisper, raspy and strained as if it hadn't been used in a long time. "He's coming," she said, her eyes not leaving mine. A chill crept up my spine. "Who's coming?" I asked, but she didn't answer. She just continued to stare at me with those unnerving eyes. I backed out of the room and closed the door, trying to shake off the unsettling feeling. I hurried to the nurse's station and checked the patient logs again. Room 308 was supposed to be empty. I grabbed the phone and called the head nurse, telling her about the woman in the room, but she sounded confused. "Thomas, there's no patient in room 308. That room's been closed off for renovation." I stared down the hallway, the door to room 308 now firmly closed. "No, I just saw someone. She's there," I insisted. "Check again, but I'm telling you, it's empty." I hung up the phone and made my way back down the hall. As I approached the door, I could feel the air grow heavier. I hesitated for a moment before reaching for the handle, my pulse quickening despite my efforts to stay calm. Slowly, I opened the door. The bed was empty. The woman was gone, and the room was just as it should have been, clean, but unused for some time. Confused, I looked around the room for any sign of her, but there was nothing. No footprints on the floor, no signs that anyone had been in there at all. I decided to chalk it up to exhaustion. Maybe I had imagined it, or maybe someone had wandered into the wrong room and left. Either way, I convinced myself it wasn't worth worrying about and went back to my rounds. The rest of the night passed uneventfully, but I couldn't shake the image of that woman from my mind. The way she had stared at me, the cryptic warning about him coming, it gnawed at me. Still, I finished my shift and went home, hoping I'd just forget about it. But the next night, it happened again. This time, it was around 1:30 a.m. I was doing my usual rounds when I passed by room 308, and there she was again, sitting in the bed, staring at me with those same wide, unblinking eyes. My chest tightened as I approached the room. "Ma'am, you shouldn't be in here," I said, stepping cautiously toward her. She didn't respond at first, just like the night before. Then, in that same raspy whisper, she spoke. "He's here." Before I could react, the door to the room slammed shut behind me. I spun around, my breath catching in my throat. I tried the handle, but it wouldn't budge. Panic set in as I turned back toward the woman, but she was gone. The bed was empty again, just like the night before. Suddenly, the overhead lights began to flicker, casting long, eerie shadows across the room. The air felt thick and oppressive, and I could hear a low rumbling sound, like something heavy moving just beyond the walls. I pressed my ear to the door, listening, and that's when I heard it. Footsteps, slow and deliberate, coming down the hallway. I banged on the door, shouting for help, but no one responded. The footsteps grew louder, and closer until they stopped right outside the door. For a long, agonizing moment, there was nothing but silence. Then, something scratched at the door, slow and deliberate, like nails dragging across wood. I backed away, my mind racing for an explanation. The lights flickered one last time before plunging the room into darkness. I stood there, frozen, waiting for something, anything, to happen. Suddenly the door swung open, and the lights flickered back to life. I rushed out into the hallway, looking around for any sign of whoever, or whatever, had been outside. But the corridor was empty, as quiet as ever. I didn't finish my shift that night. I told my supervisor I was sick and went home, my mind a whirlwind of confusion and fear. I haven't worked the night shift since then, and I don't think I ever will again. There's something wrong with room 308. Maybe it's the spirit of a patient who never left, or maybe it's something darker, something that's been waiting in that abandoned wing for years. Whatever it is, I know one thing for sure: it's not done, and it's still there, waiting for someone to come back. My name is Ryan Hargrove, and I've been a nurse at White Ridge Medical Center for just under a year. At 25, I was the youngest member of the night shift staff, living alone in a modest apartment at 78 Parkside Drive. The pay wasn't great, but it was enough to cover rent and the occasional night out with friends. I didn't mind the long hours, and honestly, the hospital at night had a calmness to it that I found comforting, until the night I was assigned to room 216. Room 216 was located in the hospital's older wing, a part of the building that hadn't seen any major renovations since the 1970s. Most of the staff hated being assigned there. The place had strange energy, fluorescent lights that buzzed too loudly, rooms that felt colder than the rest of the hospital, and that eerie silence that seemed to settle just a little too deeply. But tonight, the hospital was unusually packed, and I didn't have much of a choice. I was briefed quickly before my shift began. An elderly man, Mr. Howard, had been moved to room 216 just that afternoon. He was in for post-surgery recovery after a routine procedure, and everything was supposed to be straightforward. My job was to monitor his vitals, make sure he was comfortable, and check in every hour or so. When I first entered the room around 10 p.m., Mr. Howard was already asleep. He looked frail, his thin white hair plastered against his scalp, and his skin almost translucent under the hospital lighting. The room smelled sterile, like all hospital rooms. But there was something else too, a faint odor, almost like mildew, that made me wrinkle my nose. I checked his charts, made sure his IV was in place, and left the room quietly. It was around midnight when I started hearing the sounds. I was at the nurse's station, sipping some coffee to stay awake, when I heard a strange scratching noise coming from down the hall. It was faint at first, almost too quiet to notice, but it grew louder the longer I listened. I stood up and glanced toward the hallway leading to room 216. The sound seemed to be coming from there, like something was moving against the walls. I chalked it up to one of the patients or maybe even an animal that had gotten into the building. It wasn't unheard of in this older part of the hospital. I made my way down the dimly lit corridor, the floor tiles creaking slightly under my weight. As I approached room 216, the sound stopped abruptly. I paused for a moment outside the door, half expecting to hear it again, but there was only silence. Figuring it was nothing, I pushed open the door and stepped inside. Mr. Howard was still asleep, his breathing slow and steady. Everything seemed normal, except for the IV line. It had been pulled loose, lying coiled on the floor like it had been ripped out. I moved quickly to reattach it, thinking maybe Mr. Howard had accidentally pulled it out in his sleep. But when I checked his arm, there were no signs that the needle had been pulled or tugged violently. It was like someone, or something, had deliberately removed it. I reattached the line, checked his vitals, and left the room, shaking off the strange feeling that was gnawing at the back of my mind. It was just after 2 a.m., when things started to get strange. I was doing my usual rounds when I passed by room 216 again. This time the door was slightly ajar, though I was certain I had closed it earlier. I hesitated before pushing it open. The air inside the room felt colder than the hallway, and I could hear a faint wheezing sound. My eyes immediately went to Mr. Howard. He was sitting upright in bed, staring straight ahead, his eyes wide open but vacant. His chest rose and fell in shallow breaths, the wheezing growing louder with each exhale. But what got to me was the way his head slowly turned toward me, his mouth barely moving as he whispered something under his breath. I stepped closer, trying to make out what he was saying. "She's here," he muttered, his voice hoarse and distant. "Who's here?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. I don't know why I felt the need to keep my voice low, but something about the room made it feel wrong to speak too loudly. But Mr. Howard didn't respond. Instead, his eyes rolled back into his head and he slumped back onto the bed. I rushed forward, grabbing the stethoscope from around my neck and checking his pulse. His vitals were all over the place, his heart rate spiking, his breathing shallow. I grabbed the call button to alert the on-call doctor, but before I could press it, I heard the sound again. The scratching. This time it was coming from the walls. I spun around, scanning the room, but there was nothing there. The noise grew louder, moving across the walls like something was crawling just beneath the surface. I backed away from the bed, my eyes darting between the walls and the door, trying to make sense of what I was hearing. Then, the lights began to flicker. The room was plunged into brief moments of darkness, each flicker revealing something more unsettling than the last. In one flash, I saw Mr. Howard's pale face, now contorted in fear. In the next, I caught a glimpse of movement in the corner of the room, a shadow, long and thin, stretching toward the ceiling. I don't remember deciding to move, but suddenly, I was at the door, wrenching it open and stumbling into the hallway. The air out here felt normal, warmer even, and the strange sounds had stopped. I stood there for a moment, trying to steady my breathing, before I turned back to look into the room. Mr. Howard was lying flat on the bed again, his chest no longer rising. I rushed back inside and checked his pulse. Nothing. I called for the doctor, but deep down, I knew it was too late. They listed his cause of death as cardiac arrest, but I knew better. Something had been in that room with us, something I couldn't explain. I didn't tell anyone what happened. Not my coworkers, not the doctors, not even my friends. Who would believe me? I've since requested to be transferred out of the night shift, and I avoid the older wing of the hospital whenever I can. But sometimes when I pass by that part of the building, I swear I still hear the scratching, faint but unmistakable, coming from room 216. Whatever it was, I hope it's gone, but deep down I know it's not. It's still there, waiting for the next unlucky soul to wander in. I've been a night nurse for almost 6 years, and in all that time, I thought I had seen everything. The late hours, the never-ending stream of patients, the occasional unexplained event that you learn to brush off, it all becomes routine. But I'll never forget the night I was assigned to room 517. Room 517 was located in the east wing of the hospital, an older section that was used less and less as new renovations were completed. It always had a strange aura about it, but I never put much stock in hospital gossip. According to some of the older nurses, room 517 had a bad history. They spoke in hushed voices about patients who had died there, claiming they would see things before they passed. Shadowy figures, fleeting whispers, cold hands gripping them in the night. To me, it just sounded like the usual hospital myths, something to pass the time during slow shifts. That night, I had been covering the late shift, when the charge nurse told me I'd be handling a new patient in 517. A man named David Hayes had been admitted after a serious car accident. He was unconscious but stable. I figured it would be an easy night, check his vitals, monitor his condition, and keep an eye on the machines. When I arrived, the hallway leading to 517 was eerily quiet. Most of the other rooms in that wing were empty, their lights off, and the dull hum of the building's ventilation system seemed louder than usual. The fluorescent lights flickered above me as I made my way to the door. Something about the quiet bothered me more than it should have, but I forced myself to ignore it. The first thing I noticed when I entered room 517 was how cold it was. The thermostat on the wall read a normal temperature, but the air felt icy like the room had been abandoned for years. David Hayes lay motionless on the bed, hooked up to a series of monitors that beeped softly. He was a middle-aged man, his face covered in bruises, a deep gash visible under the bandages wrapped around his head. His breathing was steady but shallow. I checked his vitals. Everything seemed normal, or at least as normal as it could be given his condition. There was nothing unusual about the monitors, nothing that would have triggered any concern. But there was something off. A strange sense of unease settled over me, like I wasn't alone in the room. As I stood by the bed, I thought I heard something, a faint sound, almost like a whisper. It was so quiet that at first I assumed it was my imagination. But then it happened again, a soft, indistinct murmur coming from somewhere in the room. I glanced around, my eyes darting to the corners where the shadows seemed to cling to the walls. Nothing. The sound stopped, leaving behind an uncomfortable silence. I shook it off, telling myself it was just the wind outside. or maybe the ventilation system acting up. Still, I found myself glancing at the clock more often, hoping the shift would pass quickly. As the hours dragged on, the feeling of unease grew stronger. Around 3 a.m., I was reviewing some paperwork at the nurse's station when I saw something flicker on the monitor showing David's room. The camera positioned in the corner of room 517 displayed a view of the bed and most of the room. At first, I thought it was just a glitch, static interference or something like that. But when I looked closer, I saw it. A shadow. It wasn't coming from the machinery, and it wasn't mine. It moved slowly, creeping along the far wall, just out of reach of the light from the hallway. The shape was human-like, but distorted, almost as if it was slinking along the wall. I blinked, leaning closer to the monitor, but the shadow was gone. I told myself it had to be a trick of the light, maybe some malfunction with the camera. But I couldn't shake the chill that settled over me. I knew I had to check on David, just to be sure. As I walked back down the hallway toward room 517, that familiar coldness intensified, seeping into my skin like ice. The door to the room was slightly ajar, though I was certain I had closed it before. I hesitated before pushing it open. Inside, everything appeared normal at first glance. David was still lying in bed, the machine still beeping rhythmically. But something was different. The air felt heavier, the shadows in the room deeper than before. I approached the bed cautiously, checking the monitors again. Nothing had changed, but the strange oppressive feeling persisted. Then, as I turned to leave, I saw movement in my peripheral vision. I spun around, my eyes locking onto the far corner of the room. There, standing in the shadow, was a figure. It was faint, barely more than a dark outline against the wall, but it was unmistakably human-shaped. Tall, with unnaturally long limbs that seemed to stretch toward the ceiling. It didn't move, just stood there, watching. My breath caught in my throat as I tried to make sense of what I was seeing. Suddenly the figure shifted, its body moving in a way that defied explanation, its limbs bent at odd angles, its head tilting unnaturally to the side. And then, it started to move toward the bed. I couldn't move, frozen in place as the figure glided across the room. It stopped at the foot of David's bed, its face, or what should have been a face, turning toward him. A low guttural sound filled the room, almost like a growl, and for the first time, I saw David's eyes flutter open. He wasn't fully conscious, but his eyes were wide with fear, darting around the room as if searching for something. The shadowy figure leaned closer to him, its form hovering above the bed. I wanted to scream, to run, to do something, but I couldn't. Then, as suddenly as it had appeared, the figure vanished. The room returned to its previous state, the shadows retreating, the cold dissipating. David's eyes fluttered shut again, and the machines continued their steady beeping as though nothing had happened. I stumbled out of the room, my legs shaking as I made my way back to the nurse's station. I didn't know how to explain what I had seen, but I knew one thing for certain: I wasn't going back to room 517. The following day, I requested a transfer. I couldn't stay in that wing, not after what happened. I heard that David Hayes passed away a few days later, his cause of death listed as natural causes. But I knew better. There was something in room 517, something dark, something wrong. And whatever it was, I was sure it wasn't done yet. Hospitals always had an eerie feeling to them late at night, and working the night shift as a nurse made you notice things no one else would. The hallways, usually bustling with people during the day, fell silent after 10 p.m. The only sounds were the hum of machines, the occasional shuffle of feet, and the distant beeping from heart monitors. I had been working at St. Mary's for about 3 years. The job was steady, and for the most part, uneventful. But the night I was assigned to room 12 in the ICU would change everything I thought I knew about the hospital. Room 12 had been empty for a while, ever since a man named Victor Greaves passed away a few months back. He'd been a difficult patient, not in the sense that he complained or caused trouble, but in the way he acted. Every night he'd start muttering under his breath, talking to someone who wasn't there. He'd stare at the far corner of the room, his eyes wide with terror, even though nothing was there. "He's coming for me," he'd say. "I can hear him. He's in the walls." The doctors chalked it up to dementia or delirium from his illness, but it rattled the staff. Since his death, room 12 has become notorious. Nurses would joke about it, calling it the haunted room, but no one ever wanted to work in there, especially on the night shift. I never believed in any of the stories. I figured it was just a way for people to pass the time. That night, I had no choice but to check on a new patient admitted into room 12. His name was Daniel Turner, 48, recovering from a severe heart attack. He was unconscious, hooked up to a ventilator and a series of machines that kept him stable. As I walked down the dim hallway toward room 12, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. When I reached the door, I hesitated. The room was dark, the only light coming from the monitors near the bed. Daniel lay motionless, his chest rising and falling in rhythm with the machine. I did my usual checks, blood pressure, heart rate, oxygen levels, all normal. But as I stood there, I felt a sudden chill. The room was unusually cold, colder than the rest of the hospital. I checked the thermostat, but it was set to the same temperature as every other room. I shrugged it off and started to leave. But as I reached for the door handle, I heard it. A faint whisper. It was so quiet, I thought I had imagined it. I stopped, listening closely, but there was only silence. Shaking my head, I turned back to the door. But then I heard it again. This time, it was clearer, a soft voice, barely more than a murmur, but unmistakable. "Help me." I froze, my hand still on the door. It wasn't coming from Daniel. His breathing was steady, his eyes closed. The voice seemed to come from the walls. I looked around the room, trying to find the source, but there was nothing. Just the steady beeping of the machines. I left the room as quickly as I could, returning to the nurse's station. I tried to brush off the experience, convincing myself that the stress of the night was playing tricks on my mind. But the feeling of unease wouldn't leave me. Later that night, around 3 a.m., I checked the monitors again. Daniel's vitals were normal, but the video feed from room 12 flickered. It wasn't uncommon for the older cameras to glitch occasionally, so I didn't think much of it. But then, in the corner of the screen, I saw something. At first I thought it was just a shadow, but as I watched, the shape became clearer. A figure, tall, thin, and draped in darkness, stood near the foot of Daniel's bed. It didn't move, didn't make a sound, but it was there. I blinked, leaning closer to the screen, and at that moment the camera cut out completely, replaced by static. Panic surged through me. I grabbed the emergency phone and called the on-call doctor. But they assured me everything was fine. Just a glitch in the camera, they said. The patient's stable. But I couldn't shake the dread building inside me. Something wasn't right. Against my better judgment, I decided to check the room myself. As I walked down the hallway, the hospital seemed quieter than usual. The hum of the lights, the soft rustle of air from the vents, everything felt muted. When I reached the door to room 12, I hesitated again. I didn't want to go inside, but I had to know. I pushed the door open slowly. The room was dark, just as I had left it, but there was something different. The air felt heavier, thick with an oppressive weight. Daniel lay in the bed, still unconscious, but the beeping from his monitor had quickened slightly. I glanced toward the corner where I had seen the figure on the camera. At first there was nothing. Just a shadow. But as I looked closer, the shadow seemed to move. A figure, a man, tall and gaunt, his face hidden in darkness, stood there, just as I had seen on the screen. I couldn't breathe. My mind screamed for me to run, to get out of the room, but my legs wouldn't move. The figure stepped forward, slowly, deliberately, and as it did, the temperature in the room dropped even further. I could see my breath in front of me, misting in the cold air. The figure moved to the foot of Daniel's bed, just as it had before. It stood there for a moment, staring down at him, then slowly turned its head toward me. Though its face was shrouded in shadow, I felt its eyes lock onto mine. I stumbled backward, my back hitting the doorframe. Without thinking, I turned and ran, leaving the room and slamming the door behind me. The rest of the night was a blur. I couldn't go back to room 12, and I avoided it for the rest of my shift. In the morning, when the day staff arrived, I reported the strange events to the charge nurse. She gave me a concerned look but didn't say much, just nodded and made a note of it. A few days later I heard that Daniel Turner had passed away unexpectedly in room 12. No one could explain it. He had been stable and recovering, but something had gone wrong. They said he died peacefully in his sleep, but I knew better. Something had come for him that night, just as it had for Victor Greaves, and I had seen it. To this day I avoid that part of the hospital. I don't know what I saw in room 12, but I know it wasn't human. And I know that it's still there, waiting for its next victim. Hospitals are places of healing, but for those of us who work the night shift, they can become places of unsettling silence, where the line between the living and the dead blurs. I'd been a nurse at St. Vincent's Hospital for about 6 years, and I'd heard my share of eerie stories. Most of them were dismissed as nothing more than overworked imaginations. But what happened on the 7th floor still keeps me up at night. The 7th floor was the ICU and trauma recovery ward, a place where we saw the worst of the worst. Critical patients would come in after car accidents, violent crimes, or sudden medical emergencies. Some would make it through, while others wouldn't. I was assigned to the 7th floor a lot, but I always felt a strange sense of unease whenever I worked there. It was around 2 a.m. when the charge nurse, Kim, told me I needed to check on a patient in room 721. His name was James Foster, a 60-year-old man who had suffered severe trauma in a hit-and-run accident. He'd been in a coma for 3 weeks, his prognosis uncertain. The doctors weren't optimistic, but he was stable enough to be in the recovery ward. I hadn't heard much about him, except for rumors among the staff that strange things had been happening since his arrival. As I walked down the hallway toward room 721, the hospital was eerily quiet. The fluorescent lights flickered occasionally, and the air felt heavier than usual. I reached the door and paused for a moment. There was something off about that room, something I couldn't quite explain. I pushed the door open and stepped inside. The room was dimly lit by a single overhead light, casting long shadows across the walls. James lay motionless in the bed, hooked up to various machines. The rhythmic beeping of the heart monitor was the only sound in the room. I walked over to his bedside and began my usual checks. Blood pressure, oxygen levels, temperature. Everything seemed normal, except for one thing: the room felt ice cold. I glanced at the thermostat, but it was set to the usual temperature. I adjusted it slightly, but the cold persisted, seeping into my bones. I tried to ignore it and focused on James. As I turned to leave, I heard something that made me freeze. A whisper. It was faint, almost inaudible, but it was there. I glanced around the room, expecting to see another nurse or a visitor, but the room was empty. I leaned in closer to James, thinking maybe he had woken up, but his eyes were still closed, his body completely still. Then, I heard it again. "Help me." The voice was weak, desperate, and unmistakably coming from James. I stepped back, my stomach tightening with dread. I knew it wasn't possible. James was in a coma, completely unresponsive. Yet, the voice had come from his direction. I turned and quickly left the room, heading back to the nurse's station. Kim was sitting there, reading a chart, and I tried to compose myself before speaking. "Hey Kim, have you noticed anything strange about room 721? She looked up, raising an eyebrow. "What do you mean?" "I thought I heard something. Someone talking," I said, feeling ridiculous even as the words left my mouth. Kim stared at me for a moment, then sighed. "You're not the first one to say that," she said quietly. "Ever since Mr. Foster was admitted, some of the night staff have been reporting weird things. Voices, cold spots, lights flickering. I don't know what to make of it, but you're not imagining things." Her words didn't make me feel any better. They only added to the growing sense of unease. I decided to finish my rounds and avoid room 721 for the rest of the night. A few hours later, around 4 a.m., I was back at the nurse's station, when the monitors from room 721 began to go off. The alarms were loud, piercing through the quiet hallway. I rushed down to the room, my pulse quickening with every step. When I reached the room, I found the door slightly ajar. I pushed it open and froze in the doorway. James was sitting up in bed. His eyes were wide open, staring straight ahead. His hands gripped the bed rails so tightly that his knuckles were white. The machines were still connected to him, but they weren't beeping anymore. They were completely silent, even though the alarms had been blaring just moments before. "Mr. Foster?" I said cautiously, stepping into the room. He didn't respond. His eyes remained fixed on the far corner of the room as if he were watching something, or someone, that I couldn't see. I slowly approached the bed, unsure of what to do. He shouldn't have been awake, let alone sitting up. His medical condition made that impossible, but here he was, sitting bolt upright, his breathing shallow and rapid. "Mr. Foster?" I repeated louder this time. His head snapped toward me, his eyes locking onto mine. There was something in his gaze that sent a chill down my spine, something dark and unnatural. He opened his mouth, but no words came out. Instead, a low, guttural sound escaped his throat, like a growl. I backed away, my instincts screaming at me to leave the room. But before I could turn, the lights in the room flickered violently, and the temperature dropped even further. The machines connected to James began to beep erratically, and the growling sound grew louder. And then, in an instant, everything stopped. The lights stabilized, the machines went silent, and James collapsed back onto the bed, his body limp and lifeless. I stood there, staring at his still form, unsure of what had just happened. I slowly approached the bed and checked his vitals. His pulse was weak, but steady. His breathing had returned to its normal rhythm. It was as if the entire episode had never happened. But I knew what I had seen. I knew that something unnatural had taken place in that room. I called the attending doctor and reported the incident, but they brushed it off as a temporary neurological episode. No one believed me when I told them what I had experienced. They chalked it up to exhaustion, stress, or an overactive imagination. But I knew better. For the next few nights, I avoided room 721 as much as possible. I made sure that other nurses handled James's care, and I stuck to the lower floors. But the strange occurrences continued. Other nurses reported hearing whispers, seeing shadows move in the corners of their eyes, and feeling the same bone-chilling cold in the room. One night, about a week later, James passed away. The official cause of death was listed as complications from his injuries, but I knew it wasn't that simple. Something had been in that room with him, something dark, something evil. And even after his death, I couldn't shake the feeling that it was still there, waiting for its next victim. I've since transferred to a different hospital, far away from St. Vincent's, but I still think about that night. I still hear the whispers in my dreams, and sometimes, when I wake up in the dead of night, I feel the same cold creeping over me. Whatever it was in room 721, it's not finished, it never left. And I fear that one day, it will come for me too. Hospitals are strange places at night. The halls are quieter, the staff fewer, and the darkness outside makes the bright white lights inside feel unnatural. I've been a nurse at Greenwood Memorial Hospital for over a decade, and the night shifts were never my favorite. They were peaceful, sure, but something about them always felt off, especially on the third floor, where the older wings hadn't seen a renovation since the 80s. That particular night was no different. I had just started my shift around 11 p.m. The hospital was quieter than usual, probably because it was midweek, and we didn't have the typical rush of emergency cases. My rounds included checking on post-op patients in the recovery ward, which was mostly routine. But there was one room on my list that I wasn't thrilled about. Room 303. Room 303 had been empty for weeks, but strange things had been happening around it. Patients in nearby rooms had reported hearing noises, whispers, the sound of something moving around, doors creaking. A few of the newer nurses swore they saw shadows under the door as if someone was inside. But whenever anyone checked, it was always empty. The maintenance team had inspected it several times, finding nothing wrong. Still, the rumors persisted, and no one liked going near that room. I didn't believe in ghosts or anything like that, but I wasn't about to ignore the fact that something was making everyone uneasy. So, when I saw that I'd have to do a routine check on the room that night, I felt a bit of dread creeping in. I started with the occupied rooms first, making my way down the hall. The fluorescent lights buzzed above me, casting a harsh glow on the tile floor. Everything was normal, as expected. The patients were either asleep or quietly watching TV, and I noted their vitals with nothing out of the ordinary. Then I reached the door to room 303. It was slightly ajar, which was odd since it was supposed to be closed and locked. I pushed it open slowly, the door creaking louder than usual in the stillness of the hospital. The room was exactly how it should have been, empty. The bed was made, the lights were off, and the only sound was the distant hum of machines from other rooms down the hall. I took a deep breath and stepped inside to do my standard check, feeling an irrational chill run down my spine. I glanced at the empty bed, expecting nothing, but that's when I noticed something odd. The sheets looked disturbed, as if someone had been sitting or lying on them, even though I knew no one had been in the room for days. I walked over, inspecting the bed closer. The imprint of a body was faint but there. I straightened up, feeling a growing unease. There was no logical reason for the sheets to look like that, but I told myself it was probably just a trick of the light. I took out my chart and jotted down a few notes, getting ready to leave as quickly as possible. As I turned to head for the door, the lights flickered. It was brief, just a split second, but it was enough to stop me in my tracks. Hospitals aren't immune to the occasional power flicker, but this felt different. I stood still, waiting for the lights to stabilize, and they did. Everything seemed normal again, until I heard it. A faint whisper. It was so soft that I almost thought I was imagining it, but there it was again. This time louder, clearer. It was a single word, barely audible but unmistakable: help. I froze, scanning the empty room, looking for some source of the voice. There was no one there. The room was silent, the door still slightly ajar, the hallway beyond dimly lit. Help. The voice came again, and I realized with a sinking feeling that it was coming from the far corner of the room. Slowly, I turned my head, my eyes straining to see in the shadowy corner. There was nothing there. Just the small bathroom door, slightly ajar like the room's entrance. A cold sweat broke out across my forehead. Every instinct screamed at me to leave, but I couldn't help myself. I took a step toward the bathroom, my shoes echoing on the linoleum floor. Another step, and then another. I reached out to push the door fully open, my hand trembling ever so slightly. The bathroom was empty. Of course it was empty. There hadn't been anyone in this room for weeks. I let out a breath I hadn't realized I'd been holding, and turned to leave. But then, something moved in the mirror. Just behind me. I whipped around, expecting to see a shadow or some trick of the light, but the room was as still as ever. No one was there. I looked back at the mirror, and my reflection stared back at me, looking pale and nervous. I decided I had enough. Whatever was going on in room 303, I didn't want any part of it. I hurried out of the room, pulled the door shut behind me, and returned to the nurse's station. I didn't mention the voice or the strange things I'd seen. I wasn't about to feed into the rumors. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong with that room. Something more than just an empty hospital room with creaking floors and flickering lights. Later that night, around 4 a.m., I was sitting at the nurse's station, catching up on some paperwork when the intercom crackled to life. The hospital's intercom system was ancient, and it wasn't uncommon for it to act up, so I didn't think much of it at first. But then, I heard the voice. Help. It was the same voice I'd heard in room 303, soft, weak, pleading. I stared at the intercom speaker, dread pooling in my stomach. The voice repeated, more insistent this time. Help me. I quickly grabbed the phone and called the security desk. A guard picked up on the second ring. Hey, can you check the third-floor intercom? I think it's malfunctioning, I said, trying to keep my voice steady. There was a brief pause on the other end before the guard responded. Third-floor intercom? That's strange. We haven't had any systems hooked up to that floor in months. What do you mean? I asked, a chill running down my spine. The third-floor intercom's been offline since they started renovations. There's no way anything's coming through from up there. I hung up the phone, my hand shaking slightly. The voice had stopped, and the hospital was silent again. I don't work the night shifts anymore. After that night, I requested a transfer to day shifts, and I avoided the third floor whenever I could. But now and then, I hear the rumors from the other nurses, whispers, strange shadows, and that one room that no one likes to talk about. Room 303. And every time I pass it, I swear I can still hear the faint sound of someone calling for help from inside. Hospitals have an air of calm during the day, a steady stream of footsteps, beeping machines and chatter that somehow drowns out the stillness. But when the night shift rolls around, the place changes. The dim lighting, the echo of empty halls, and the way shadows seem to stretch longer than they should, it's enough to make anyone feel uneasy. I've worked as a night nurse at Riverwood General for over 8 years, and I've seen my fair share of odd things, but nothing compares to the events that took place in room 503 one cold December night. The patient, a man in his 42nd named Peter, had been brought in after a near-fatal car accident. His injuries were severe, and while his body was healing, he had been unconscious since the night of the crash. The doctors said he was in a coma, and there was little hope of recovery. I was told to check on him every couple of hours during my rounds, just to make sure his vitals were stable. It was supposed to be routine, it wasn't. That night the hospital felt quieter than usual. It was the kind of quiet that made you feel like something was watching you, just out of sight. I remember feeling a chill as I passed the entrance to the ICU, but I brushed it off. After all, night shifts could do that to you, especially in a place like this. I entered Peter's room around midnight for my first check. The soft beeping of the machines filled the space, a constant reminder of the fragile thread between life and death. Peter lay motionless, his chest rising and falling in a slow mechanical rhythm. Everything seemed fine at first, but as I turned to leave, I heard something that made me freeze. A faint whisper. So quiet I wasn't sure if I imagined it. I stopped and glanced back at Peter. His eyes were still closed, his body unmoving. I shook my head and left, trying to push the unease away. Over the next couple of hours, strange things started happening. The monitors in Peter's room would glitch for a second, spiking his heart rate, only for it to return to normal as soon as I approached. The lights in the hall outside his room flickered, something they never did on the ICU floor. Then, just after 2 a.m., I saw it. I had just stepped out of another patient's room when I noticed a shadow standing at the far end of the hallway. It was tall, too tall to be anyone I knew on staff. My breath caught in my throat as the figure seemed to shift, growing darker and more defined. I blinked and it was gone. I hurried to the nurse's station, trying to rationalize what I had seen. Stress, fatigue, it had to be my mind playing tricks on me, but the pit in my stomach told me otherwise. At 3:30 a.m., I made my way back to Peter's room for another check. The lights outside his door flickered as I approached, and for a moment I hesitated, but I had a job to do. I stepped inside, the familiar beeping greeting me. Except something was different. Peter's eyes were open. I stopped, my hand hovering over the tablet where I logged my rounds. His gaze was fixed on the ceiling, unblinking. I checked the monitors. They were normal, but he wasn't supposed to be awake. The doctors had said he might never regain consciousness. "Peter?" I whispered, my voice barely audible. He didn't respond. His eyes didn't move. It was like he was staring through the ceiling, at something I couldn't see. I approached the bed cautiously, feeling that same chill I'd felt earlier in the night. As I reached for the call button to notify the doctors, Peter's lips moved. At first it was just a twitch, but then he spoke, his voice raspy and dry. "He's here." I felt a cold rush of fear flood my veins. "Woo?" I asked, my voice shaking. Peter's head slowly turned toward me, his eyes wide but still unfocused. "The shadow. It follows Mem." Before I could react, the monitors next to the bed flatlined. I rushed to his side, checking his pulse. Nothing. The machines were still screaming, filling the room with their piercing alarm. I frantically pressed the emergency call button, calling for help. The doctors rushed in, and within minutes they were trying to revive him. But it was too late. Peter was gone. I left the room, shaken to my core. As I stood in the hallway watching the medical team work in vain, I glanced toward the end of the hall. That same shadow, the one I'd seen earlier, stood there, motionless, darker than ever. And this time, I knew I wasn't imagining it. I've been working the night shift as a hospital orderly for over a decade. It's a job I'm used to, one that comes with its share of eerie moments, but nothing too sinister. At least, that's what I thought until last winter when I was assigned to St. Matthew's, a small, older hospital on the edge of town. The place had history, a lot of it, Some of the staff whispered that St. Matthew's was haunted, but I'd always been skeptical. Hospitals by nature are unsettling places, and when you're working long hours in the dead of night, your mind can play tricks on you. It started on my 3rd week there, around 2 a.m., the dead hour as some nurses called it. The halls were quiet, save for the occasional beeping of machines and the low murmur of distant conversations at the nurses' station. Most of the patients were asleep, and I was making my usual rounds, checking rooms and making sure everything was in order. Room 409 was tucked away in the far corner of the 3rd floor. I hated going in there, even though I couldn't quite explain why. The patient was an older woman named Helen Carter, who had been in a medically induced coma for weeks. Her family rarely visited, and the room always felt unnaturally cold, even when the thermostat was cranked up. I pushed the door open and stepped inside, the dim light from the hallway casting long shadows across the floor. Helen lay still, hooked up to a ventilator, her chest rising and falling in a slow, steady rhythm. I did my usual check of her vitals, glancing at the monitors, but something was off. The room felt wrong. At first, I chalked it up to fatigue. It was late, and I hadn't slept well the night before. But as I turned to leave, I heard a whisper. It was so faint that I wasn't sure I had heard it at all. I stopped, straining to listen. Then, clear as day, I heard it again. "Help me." I froze, my hand gripping the doorknob. I turned back to Helen. Her eyes were still closed, her body motionless, but the whisper had come from her direction. My skin prickled with unease, and I felt a chill creep up my spine. I knew it couldn't have been her. She was in a coma, unresponsive. But as I stood there, staring at her pale, unmoving face, I heard it again, louder this time. "Help me." My instinct was to leave, to bolt out of the room, and never come back. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. I slowly approached the bed, my heart thudding in my ears. "Helen?" I whispered, feeling ridiculous for even asking. "Can you hear me?" There was no response. The room was dead silent, except for the low hum of the machines. I stood there for a moment longer, waiting, but nothing happened. I finally convinced myself that I was imagining things, that it was just exhaustion playing tricks on me. I left the room, shutting the door behind me and trying to push the incident from my mind. But things only got stranger from there. The next night, as I was doing my rounds, I passed by room 409 again. I wasn't even planning on going in, but something caught my eye. The door, which I had left closed, was slightly ajar. That was odd. The nurses were meticulous about keeping doors closed during the night, especially in the ICU. I hesitated for a moment, then pushed the door open. The room was dark, save for the dim light of the monitors casting an eerie glow across Helen's bed. Everything seemed normal at first, but then I noticed something that made my stomach drop. Helen was staring at me. Her eyes, which had been closed and unresponsive for weeks, were wide open, fixed on me with a blank, vacant expression. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. Her body was still, her chest rising and falling with the help of the ventilator, but her eyes, they were alive, almost as if they were trying to tell me something. I stepped closer, trying to rationalize what I was seeing. Maybe she had come out of the coma? Maybe this was some sort of medical anomaly. But as I approached the bed, her lips parted, and that same voice, that soft, chilling whisper filled the room. "Help me." I stumbled back, nearly knocking over the IV stand. My mind raced, trying to make sense of what was happening. I hit the call button, summoning the nurses, and within moments they rushed in, checking her vitals and speaking in calm, measured tones. But none of them seemed to notice what I had seen. They didn't see her eyes open, they didn't hear her voice. When I tried to explain, they brushed it off. "Patients in comas sometimes have involuntary muscle movements," one of the nurses said. "It's nothing to worry about." But it was something to worry about. For the next few nights, things only got worse. Every time I entered room 409, Helen's eyes would be open, staring at me, her lips moving, whispering that same plea for help. I started avoiding the room altogether, but even then, I couldn't escape it. I'd hear her voice in the hallways, soft and distant, calling my name, begging for help. One night, as I was finishing up my shift, I decided to look into Helen's file. I needed to know more about her, about why she was here. What I found sent a shiver down my spine. Helen had been admitted after a stroke, but before that she had been involved in a strange incident. According to the notes, she had been found wandering near an abandoned house on the outskirts of town, muttering about shadows and voices. The police report stated that she had been disoriented and confused, claiming that something was following her. As I read the report, the air around me seemed to grow colder. The pieces started falling into place, and I realized that whatever had followed Helen hadn't left her. It was still with her, in that room, waiting. I transferred to a different hospital the following week. I couldn't stay there, not after everything I had seen, but even now, I can't shake the feeling that something followed me too. Now and then, in the dead of night, I hear that same voice, faint and distant, whispering, "Help me." Working as a night nurse at Memorial General Hospital can be both exhausting and mind-numbing, but it's the quiet hours that get under your skin. I've seen my fair share of strange things over the years, patients talking to people who weren't there, alarms going off for no reason, but none of that compared to what happened in the West Wing last November. The West Wing of the hospital was old, mostly unused, and scheduled to be renovated. Only a few rooms were still in operation, and they were reserved for long-term care patients who needed minimal supervision. My job during the night shift was to check on these patients, monitor vitals, and ensure everything ran smoothly. It was usually peaceful, almost too peaceful, but there was something about that wing that always made me uneasy. One patient in particular, Mr. Jacobson, had been there longer than anyone else. He was a man in his late 60s, admitted after a severe stroke left him paralyzed from the waist down and unable to speak. He had no family and rarely received visitors, so the nurses became his only source of interaction. His room, 307, was at the end of the hallway, isolated from the rest of the ward. On my first night covering the West Wing, I remember stepping into his room and feeling an overwhelming sense of dread. The air was stale, and it felt colder than the rest of the hospital. I chalked it up to the old building's poor insulation, but it never fully explained the way my skin crawled when I stood next to his bed. Despite being unconscious most of the time, his eyes were always open, locked in a distant, glassy stare. One night, around 2:30 a.m., I was making my rounds as usual. The West Wing was deserted, the only sound being the faint hum of the fluorescent lights overhead. As I approached room 307, I noticed something strange. Mr. Jacobson's door was open. I was sure I had closed it earlier, a habit every nurse had to avoid disturbing the few patients who resided there. I paused, staring down the darkened hallway, waiting for any sign of movement. Nothing. The air seemed thicker, heavier than usual, and as I approached the door, an odd sensation washed over me, like someone was watching me. I brushed it off and walked inside. Mr. Jacobson was lying in bed, his body completely still as usual, but his eyes, those wide, unblinking eyes, seemed to follow me as I entered. I went through the usual routine, checked his IV, made sure his monitors were functioning, and then stepped toward the bed to adjust his pillow. That's when I saw it. At first, I thought I was imagining things, but as I leaned in closer, I realized I wasn't. Mr. Jacobson's lips were moving, just barely, a faint twitch, almost imperceptible, but there nonetheless. His eyes remained fixed on the ceiling, but his mouth continued to move as if he were trying to say something. I stood frozen, unsure of what to do. He hadn't spoken a word since his stroke. It was medically impossible. And yet, here he was, his lips forming silent words that I couldn't hear. I leaned in closer, my ear just inches from his mouth, straining to catch the faintest sound. A cold, rasping whisper. "They're coming." I jerked back, my heart skipping a beat. The room seemed to darken, and for a moment it felt like the walls were closing in. I backed out of the room, leaving Mr. Jacobson lying there, still as stone, his eyes fixed on the ceiling. His mouth had stopped moving, but those two words echoed in my mind. "They're coming." Who was coming? I tried to shake off the eerie feeling, convincing myself that it had been a trick of the mind, a result of exhaustion. But deep down, I knew something was wrong. I finished my rounds as quickly as possible, avoiding room 307 for the rest of the night. By the time my shift ended, the unease hadn't left me. I told myself I wouldn't mention it to anyone. After all, who would believe me? The next few nights were relatively quiet, but that sense of being watched never left. Every time I walked down the hall toward Mr. Jacobson's room, I felt it, a presence, lurking just beyond my line of sight. And it wasn't just the feeling of being watched, it was as if something was watching, something I couldn't see. On the fourth night, things escalated. It was a little after 3 a.m. when the monitor at the nurse's station began beeping. Room 307. Mr. Jacobson's heart rate had spiked suddenly, erratically, and I rushed to his room, fearing the worst. When I stepped inside, I was hit by a freezing blast of air, far colder than the rest of the hospital. Mr. Jacobson was thrashing in his bed, his frail body jerking violently against the restraints. His eyes were wide open, bulging, and his mouth was moving again, faster this time, forming words I couldn't hear. I tried to calm him, checking his vitals, but the machines were going haywire, giving me readings that didn't make sense. His pulse was erratic, but not in a way that matched his physical state. It was almost as if something else was affecting him, something unseen. As I reached to adjust his IV, I heard it again, the whisper. Clearer this time, like someone was standing right behind me. "They're here." I spun around, but the room was empty. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up, and I felt a sudden urge to leave. Something was in the room with us, something I couldn't see. I backed away, my eyes darting around the room, searching for any sign of movement. Then the lights flickered. For a split second, the room plunged into darkness. When the lights came back on, I saw them, shadowy figures standing at the foot of Mr. Jacobson's bed. They weren't human, their forms were twisted, their faces featureless, but I could feel their gaze burning into me. Mr. Jacobson let out a gurgling gasp, and I turned to see his face contorted in terror, his mouth stretched open in a silent scream. The figures moved closer, their shapes shifting and writhing like smoke. I bolted for the door, my pulse racing, and slammed it behind me. The hallway was empty, eerily quiet, but I could still feel them, watching, waiting. I didn't stop until I was outside, breathing in the cold night air, trying to steady myself. The next morning, Mr. Jacobson was dead. The official cause was cardiac arrest, but I knew better. Whatever had been in that room had taken him. I never returned to the West Wing after that. I requested a transfer, and luckily, I got it. But sometimes, late at night, I think about those shadowy figures, and I wonder how many others they've claimed. Because they're still there, in that room, waiting for their next victim. Working night shifts in a hospital can be eerie, but it never really bothered me, until that night. I've been a nurse at St. Augustine Memorial for almost 5 years now, and I've seen all kinds of things, strange deaths, miraculous recoveries, and the occasional odd patient. However, the hospital itself had a reputation. Some of the older staff would talk about unexplained happenings in the East Wing, but I always brushed them off. Ghost stories to pass the time on long shifts, nothing more. At least, that's what I thought. It was a quiet Friday night, the kind that makes you feel more tired than usual. The only noise was the hum of the air conditioning, and the faint beeping of monitors down the hall. We were understaffed as usual, with only 3 of us nurses covering the night shift. I was assigned to the East Wing, something that didn't usually bother me, but there had been whispers recently about that part of the hospital. Rumors spread quickly among nurses, especially about room 614. Room 614 was a long-term care room, one of the oldest in the hospital. It hadn't been used in months, but a patient had been moved there earlier that week. Mrs. Eldridge, an elderly woman in her late 70s, had been transferred from another hospital after a stroke left her bedridden. The odd thing was, she didn't have any visitors, no family, and no history that we knew of. She was just there. I made my way to her room for the midnight check. As I approached the door, a cold draft hit me, which was strange given how hot the hospital usually was at night. I paused for a moment, glancing down the hallway. The lights overhead flickered slightly, but I convinced myself it was just the old electrical system. Pushing open the door to 614, I felt a wave of unease. Mrs. Eldridge was lying in bed, completely still, except for her eyes. Wide open, staring. The pale blue of her irises looked almost cloudy, like she was staring right through me. I hesitated at the doorway, unsure why the sight unnerved me so much. Patients with her condition often lost awareness, but something about the way she was looking at me, or rather, past me, sent a chill down my spine. I went through the motions, checked her IV, adjusted her blanket, recorded her vitals. Everything seemed normal, but that feeling lingered. I glanced at her face again. And that's when I noticed something odd. Her lips were moving, barely, but they were moving. I leaned closer, trying to hear what she was saying, but there was no sound. Her lips continued to form words silently, over and over. I whispered, "Mrs. Eldridge, are you trying to speak?" Her lips stopped moving, but her eyes stayed wide, unblinking. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. But I finished my check and left the room, closing the door behind me. As I walked down the hall, I couldn't help but glance back. Her door was still shut, but the feeling of being watched didn't leave me. A few hours passed uneventfully, and I had almost forgotten the strange moment in room 614. I was sitting at the nurse's station, sipping coffee, when the call button from lit up. My heart sank a little. Mrs. Eldridge was supposed to be unconscious. She hadn't moved or spoken in days. How could she have pressed the button? I hesitated, staring at the blinking light on the panel. The nurse next to me noticed and asked, "Everything okay?" "Yeah," I lied. "Just 614. I'll check on it." I stood up and made my way down the hall. The hospital was deathly quiet, except for the soft padding of my shoes on the linoleum floor. As I approached the door to 614, I felt the temperature drop again, just like before. My hand hovered over the door handle for a moment before I pushed it open. The room was dimly lit by the small lamp on the bedside table. Mrs. Eldridge lay exactly as I had left her, her eyes still open, still staring at the ceiling. But something was different. Her lips were moving again, but this time, I could hear something, a faint whisper, almost imperceptible. I stepped closer, straining to hear. There, watching. My blood ran cold. I leaned in closer, my face just inches from hers. "What did you say?" She stopped whispering, her lips freezing mid-motion. The silence in the room was oppressive, almost tangible. I stood up quickly, deciding to leave the room, but just as I reached the door, I heard it again. A voice, not Mrs. Eldridge's, but a deep, raspy whisper, right behind me. "Leave." I spun around, but the room was empty. Mrs. Eldridge hadn't moved, hadn't made a sound. I backed out of the room, my hand fumbling for the light switch. As I flipped it off, I thought I saw something in the corner of the room, something dark, standing just beyond the reach of the light. I slammed the door shut, my breath coming faster as I hurried down the hall. Back at the nurse's station, I tried to shake off the feeling, convincing myself it was just the stress of the job. But the voice, it had been so real, so clear. For the rest of the night, I avoided the East Wing as much as possible. The call button for room 614 didn't go off again, but I couldn't help but glance at the monitor every few minutes, half expecting it to light up. As the sun began to rise, I made my final rounds. I dreaded going back to 614, but I had to. When I opened the door, the cold air greeted me once more. Mrs. Eldridge was lying in bed, her eyes closed this time. I let out a small sigh of relief. Maybe it had all been in my head. But as I approached her bed, I froze. The blanket had been pulled back, and there, on her frail, wrinkled arm, were bruises, finger-shaped bruises, as if someone had gripped her tightly. My stomach dropped. There was no one else in the room, and Mrs. Eldridge was too weak to have caused them herself. I stumbled back, my mind racing. I needed to leave. I turned to head for the door, but something stopped me. A faint noise, a whisper, coming from the bed. I looked back, and Mrs. Eldridge's eyes were open again, staring straight at me. Her lips moved one final time, and though the words were faint, I heard them clearly. "They're coming for you." I didn't stick around to find out what she meant. I quit my job the next day, and never set foot in St. Augustine Memorial again. But sometimes, in the dead of night, I still hear that whisper, and I can't shake the feeling that something is watching me.